Rosalie Kendrick stood at the ticket counter at O'Hare, chalk dust still clinging to the sleeve of her sweater from that morning's lesson. She listened to the agent read out a number she could not pay. $2,840 for the last seat to Savannah tonight. 3 hours earlier, Bertie Fowler, her father's neighbor, had called with the kind of voice nobody wants to hear through a phone. "Your daddy went down in the kitchen. They think it's his heart. Come home quick, sweetheart." Rosie had been running ever since. She ran to the bank. The account was empty. She asked at the pawn shop inside the terminal, and they offered $190 for the set of wood chisels that had been in her father's hands for 40 years, the ones he'd asked her to hold on to for him. She sold them. It still wasn't enough. 6 years in front of a classroom. 31 children a day. And there wasn't enough left in her wallet for a one-way flight to the last family she had. "Is there anyone who can send you money?" Rosie shook her head. Her mother had died when she was 11. Her brother had died 7 years ago, and she had never told a living soul the real reason why. Behind her, the line shifted and checked their phones. A few looked straight through her, as though tears were simply another kind of delay at an airport. Then a man rose from a seat in the waiting area. Nobody in that section said another word. A security officer quietly stepped aside. The agent behind the counter suddenly straightened up. The man crossed the floor, stopped at a respectful distance, and said 4 words that changed the entire night. "You'll ride with me." Rosie looked up at him, and she realized she knew this face from the kind of newspaper photographs no one wants to appear in. That night, hundreds of people walked past Rosie, but only one stopped and decided her pain mattered. If this story reached you, leave a like and pass it along to someone you think needs to hear it. They may be standing at their own impossible counter today. Subscribe to walk through the next stories with us, because nobody should have to go alone. Rosie took half a step back. The canvas bag on her shoulder slipped down a little, and she didn't bother pulling it back up. "Who are you?" She asked it without lifting her voice at the end, not as a question, but as a warning. The man didn't evade anything. "Elias Marchetti." She heard that last name fall between them like something heavy being set down on a table. For 3 seconds, she couldn't speak. Then she shook her head, hard, as though trying to brush something away from her face. "No. Thank you, but no. You know me. I know where that name shows up. I read the papers." "Then you should refuse." That answer stopped her cold. She had prepared herself to be persuaded, sweet-talked, reminded that she had no other choice left. She had prepared herself to fight all of that. She hadn't prepared for this man to nod and agree with her refusal. He didn't take another step toward her. He stayed exactly where he was, leaving between them the kind of distance any woman would find just wide enough not to be afraid. "You stay right there," he said. "I'll give you everything you need to check me out, and then you can do whatever you want." He took out his phone, typed a few lines, and began reading in the flat, even voice of a man giving a statement rather than making an offer. The aircraft registration number. The captain's name, Hollis Brandt, who had been flying for 22 years, whose license was current, and whose record she could verify in 3 minutes. His attorney's phone number, followed by one short sentence. "He'll answer at 11 o'clock at night, and he'll be annoyed, but he'll answer." The address of the hangar, the registered flight number. He read all of it, then handed her the phone with the screen still lit. "Take a picture, send it to someone." Rosie took it. Her hand was trembling, and she hated that. "I don't have anyone to send it to." He showed no pity. He only said, "Then send it to the airport police." She looked up. "Are you joking?" "No. Walk to the security post 98 feet from here, show them this, and ask them who I am." He paused for a beat. "They know me." She stared at him. He said it with complete calm, without threat, without pride, and that was exactly why it sent a chill along her spine. It was reassurance and warning folded into the same sentence, and he knew it. And he said it anyway, because he had no intention of pretending to be someone else. Behind the counter, the ticket agent stood perfectly still, as though she were afraid that even the sound of her shifting her weight would be an intrusion. Rosie handed the phone back. She didn't go to the security post. She stood there in the bright white terminal, with $190 in her wallet and a father lying 800 miles away, and she asked the only question that truly mattered. "If I get on your plane," she swallowed, "what do I owe you?" Elias didn't answer right away. He let the question remain between them for a full 3 seconds. and Rosie understood that he wasn't trying to think of a lie. He was deciding how much of the truth was enough. "You owe me being there," he said at last. "That's all. Nobody gives anything away for free." "That's true." He nodded, as if she had just stated something obvious that he had lived with all his life. But not every debt is paid with money. Rosie still didn't move. She had taught children for 6 years, and she knew how to tell when a child was lying, how to see when something was hidden in a coat pocket, how to catch that instant when a person's face betrayed the very words they had just spoken. She studied this man carefully, and she couldn't find that instant. What she found instead was a very strange kind of weariness, the kind that didn't come from flying or from the late hour, but from someplace much deeper. "Why me?" she asked. "There are thousands of people in this terminal. Because I sat over there for 40 minutes. He tipped his head toward the row of waiting seats. "And in those 40 minutes, you were the only person who sold something you didn't want to sell." Rosie went still. She had never told him about the chisel set. She hadn't told anyone. She had gone into the pawnshop downstairs, placed the rag-wrapped bundle on the glass counter, listened to the man name his price, and walked out with $190 and an empty place in her canvas bag that she hadn't dared reach into. No one had gone with her. No one had been watching. She opened her mouth to ask, but the question was stopped by something even more unsettling. She realized that this man had been watching her far longer than she had imagined, and he hadn't lied to her once. "You watched me for 40 minutes. Rosie said it aloud and heard for herself just how unsettling it sounded. "I sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes, Elias said. "You stood at this counter for 20. I didn't have to make any effort to hear you." She was about to say something sharper, but he continued before she could, and what he said made every sentence she had prepared in her head disappear. "Walter Kendrick." Rosie went completely still. "Carpenter," he continued, in that same even voice. "Walnut Staircase, building in the South Loop, 2011. Not a single nail visible anywhere on the steps. He built it in 7 weeks, and charged exactly the amount written in the contract." The terminal was still as noisy as ever. Announcements still sounded over the speakers, suitcase wheels still rolled across the stone floor, but Rosie couldn't hear any of it anymore. She had never told him her father's name. She hadn't told him what her father did for a living. In the 20 minutes she had stood at this counter, she had said only one word about him, and that word was, "Father." "How do you know?" Her voice was very quiet. "Because that building belongs to me." She took another half step back, and this time it wasn't because she was afraid. She needed room to breathe. Her father had told her about that staircase. He had talked about it for years, whenever anyone asked him about his work, always telling the part about how he had planed the handrail 3 times, because the first 2 weren't good enough for him, but he had never told her who he had built it for. Not once. That year, I hired 14 contractors, Elias said. My people went to each one of them with an envelope and explained what the right answer was if anyone asked about the schedule, the materials, or anything else. 13 took it. He paused. Your father pushed it back across the table and said he'd already been paid to build the staircase. Rosie raised a hand to her mouth. She thought of the man lying in Savannah right now, the man who for 18 months had refused surgery because he didn't want his daughter carrying another debt, and she understood that the stubbornness that had nearly killed him wasn't something new. It had been there for a very long time. What did your people do to him? The question escaped before she could stop it. Nothing. Elias looked directly into her eyes when he said it. He finished the staircase, got paid, and went home. I told them to leave him alone. Rosie was silent for a long time. Then she asked the question she hadn't dared ask anyone all night. Why would you help the daughter of a man who once refused you? Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the canvas bag on her shoulder, its straps worn thin at the edges, the bag heavy with stacks of ungraded papers she had carried all the way from the school to the bank to the pawn shop and then here. Do you know how many names I can remember out of all the people who've worked for me in 15 years? She shook her head. Very few. He said it quietly. People take the money, people say thank you, and within a week they're gone from my memory. He gave a slight shrug, barely a movement at all. Your father was the only man that year who said no to me. That's the only reason I still remember his name 15 years later. Something broke open inside Rosie's chest. Not fear, not relief, but something that lived exactly between the two and had no name. She thought of Bertie sitting in a hospital corridor 800 miles away. She thought of the clock on the emergency room wall, a clock she had never seen but that had been ticking inside her head for the past 3 hours. She thought of the chisel set sitting behind the glass in a pawn shop downstairs, and of the fact that if she couldn't get home tonight, she would have sold it for exactly $190 and nothing more. "His name is Walter," she said. "My father. He's 66 years old. He won't have the surgery because he's afraid I'll have to pay for it." Elias gave a single nod. "Then let's get Rosie back to Walter." He didn't wait for her to say anything else. He stepped forward, took hold of the strap of the canvas bag, and lifted it from her shoulder. She saw him pause for half a second at its weight, but he didn't ask what was inside. He simply shifted it to his other hand and turned toward the corridor leading to the private hangars. Rosie followed him for 3 steps before looking back. The ticket counter was still there, bright white, the agent looking down at her screen, and the next passenger had already stepped into Rosie's place. 4 minutes earlier, she had been standing in that exact spot believing that every door in the world had closed at the same time. The private hangar was on the other side of the runway, and no one checked tickets there. A uniformed man opened the glass door for them, nodded to Elias, and didn't look at Rosie even once. Inside, the concrete floor stretched so wide that the sound of her footsteps seemed to echo back from somewhere far away. The plane sat beneath a bank of white lights, smaller than she had imagined, so immaculate that it looked like something that had never been used. 2 mechanics were folding a tarp near the tail. Then a black car came through the rolling door and stopped about 30 feet from the foot of the stairs. Rosie noticed one very small thing that she would remember for the rest of her life. One of the 2 mechanics abandoned the tarp, walked around the front of the car, and opened the rear door. The man who stepped out was around 50, with salt and pepper hair combed back and a heavy coat, even though the weather wasn't cold enough to require one. He didn't thank anyone. He simply stepped out as though the door had always been expected to open itself for him. And in that instant, Rosie understood that this man wasn't anyone's subordinate in the ordinary sense of the word. He walked straight to the foot of the stairs and stopped directly in the middle of the way up. 7 hours, he said. Elias didn't break stride. "I know. 7 hours from now, they'll sit down at that table and they'll look around and they'll count who's there." "I know, Ray. You don't know." The man's voice didn't rise, but it slowed, and that slowness was more unsettling than a shout. "Your father never left a chair with his name on it empty." Elias reached the foot of the stairs. The other man didn't move aside. For 2 seconds, the 2 men stood facing each other without saying a word, and Rosie stood 4 steps away, clutching the canvas bag that had been handed back to her, hardly daring to breathe. Then Elias shifted to the right and stepped onto the first stair, passing the man as though he were passing a pillar. No shoving, no contact, not another word. Ray Sartori turned, and his eyes settled on Rosie. He looked her up and down, quickly and efficiently, the way someone accustomed to appraising objects might look at something whose value he was measuring. "Teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. Rosie went rigid. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. In the past 3 hours, she had spoken to exactly 3 people: a ticket agent, a man at the pawn shop, and the man who had just walked up those stairs, and she hadn't told any of them what she did for a living. She looked down at the sleeve of her sweater. The streak of white chalk was still there. She wanted to believe that was all he had seen. She wanted very badly to believe it. Ray Sartori didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back, walked toward the car, and the mechanic abandoned the tarp for the second time to open the door for him. Rosie stood there for 1 more beat before climbing the stairs, and she moved faster than she needed to. Inside the cabin, everything was so quiet that her ears rang. Cream leather seats, polished wood, everything placed exactly where it belonged. She sat on the edge of the seat without leaning back, set the canvas bag on her lap, and wrapped both arms around it. A member of the flight crew asked if she would like some water. "No, thank you." Asked if she needed a blanket. "No, thank you." The crew member nodded and started to walk away. Rosie looked down at her hands and saw that they were trembling, not from the cold, but in the same way they had been trembling ever since Bertie called. "Excuse me." She looked up. "Could I have the blanket, please?" For 6 years, she had been the one who spread blankets over children at nap time, the one who handed out tissues, the one who soothed and comforted. It turned out that accepting a blanket from someone else's hands was much harder than she had imagined. She pulled it up to her chest and still didn't let go of the bag. Elias sat down in the seat across from her, with a small table between them. He said nothing about the man downstairs. The cabin door closed with a solid thud, and a silver-haired man leaned his head out from the cockpit. Hollis Brandt, he said to Rosie, without needing anyone to introduce him. 2 hours and 15 minutes, ma'am. There are a few thunderstorms south of Kentucky, but we'll go around them. Rosie nodded. She meant to thank him, but her throat wouldn't let her. The plane began to taxi, and through the small window she saw that the black car was still parked exactly where it had been inside the hangar, its rear door closed, and no one stepping out of it. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the engine noise settled into a steady hum, and in that quiet Rosie could hear herself swallow. She still hadn't let go of the canvas bag. "I need to ask you something." Elias looked up. "Are you having me followed?" She asked it directly, without softening the words, because she no longer had the strength to soften anything. "My father built that staircase 15 years ago. You remember his name. You know what he did for a living. Your man downstairs took one look at me and knew I was a teacher. So I need you to tell me the truth right now, because I'm sitting on your airplane and I don't have anywhere to get off." Elias didn't react for several seconds. He didn't look offended, and he didn't rush to reassure her, and Rosie was beginning to understand that this slowness was simply how this man dealt with everything. "In 2011, I had your father investigated," he said. She tightened her grip on the bag strap. "Not because of him," he continued. "Because of me. I was only 18 then, working for my father. And in that line of work, a man who refuses money is a man with another reason. Maybe someone else is paying him more. Maybe he's keeping records of something. Maybe he belongs to the other side." He gave a slight shrug. "They tore through your father's life for 3 weeks. Then they handed me a file about this thick, and there was nothing in it. A carpenter from Bridgeport. 1 wife, 2 children, no debts, no connections, nothing at all. Just a stubborn man." Rosie felt her throat tighten at the words, 1 wife, 2 children. That file had been put together when she was 15. Her mother had died 2 years earlier, and they had still written 1 wife, which meant that even the people digging through her family's life hadn't bothered to check again. "And tonight?" she asked. "Tonight I was sitting in the waiting area and heard you give your name to the ticket agent." He looked at her. "Kendrick. I just have a very bad memory for people who've refused me, that's all." She studied him for a long moment, before finally setting the bag down on the seat beside her. It was an answer she could live with for the next 2 hours. A little while later, a tray of food was placed on the small table between them. Rosie looked down and spoke before she could stop herself. "Sandwiches? What did you think there'd be?" "I don't know." She felt her face grow warm. "Something expensive. Caviar. I don't know." Elias picked up one of the sandwiches. "My mother used to make these. Bread, a thin layer of butter, cold cuts, and she cut them diagonally instead of straight across, because she said they tasted better that way." He said it casually, as though he were talking about the weather. "Money never made them taste any better. I tried." Rosie picked one up. The first bite made her realize she hadn't eaten anything since lunch in the teacher's lounge, and even then she had only managed half of it. She ate slowly, holding the sandwich with both hands, like someone afraid she might cry if she ate any faster. "What grade do you teach?" "3rd. "How long?" 6 years. Same school." She took a sip of soup. "This morning they were learning about the life cycle of a butterfly. One of them asked me why the caterpillar agrees to crawl into the chrysalis when it has no idea what's going to happen inside." She smiled faintly, the first smile she had managed all evening. "I told him I didn't know either." Elias set his sandwich down. "Do they know where you are tonight?" Rosie fell silent. She thought about the mailbox at school, about the woman in the administrative office, about the principal she had called at 4 o'clock that afternoon to ask for an advance on her salary, and who had turned her down very politely. She kept thinking, and finally she realized that if this plane didn't make it to Savannah tonight, there wasn't a single person in the world who knew where Rosie Kendrick was. Rosie pushed the tray away by a few inches, and Elias understood that she was finished eating. "In that 3-week file," he said, "it listed 2 children." She nodded slowly. "Wesley. Younger or older?" "Younger. 3 years younger than me." And then she told him, and the story came out so smoothly that even she could hear it. "He died 7 years ago. He was 20. Car accident. Thursday night. Raining. At the intersection of Archer and Kedzie. A car ran the light coming from the other direction. He was on his way. The police said he didn't have time to brake. They said it happened very fast. She finished the whole thing without pausing once, without searching for a word, without clearing her throat. She recited it the way someone reads an address they've written on an envelope 100 times. Elias didn't ask anything else for several seconds. He looked at her, and in his mind one detail had caught like a thread snagged on a nail. He was on his way. On his way where? She hadn't said. When people talked about the death of someone they loved, they usually said too much, not too little. They told you what the person had been going to buy, who they had been going to pick up, who they had planned to go home and have dinner with, because those meaningless details were the only places where the dead still remained. But she had left that exact place empty, and she had left it empty far too neatly. "What was your father like afterward?" he asked, changing the subject. "He didn't say anything for 4 months." Rosie pulled the blanket a little higher. "I don't mean he didn't talk to me. I mean he didn't talk. He still went to work, still came home, still sat down and ate, but he didn't say a single word. Then one day he went into his workshop and started building a cabinet. He worked on that cabinet for 5 months. A cabinet the house didn't need." She gave a faint smile. "It's still in his kitchen. He keeps hot sauce and boxes of cookies in it. And you?" "I went to work." "I mean, what did you do with it?" Rosie looked down at her hands. "I went to work," she said again. "I was back in my classroom exactly 9 days after the funeral. People told me to take more time off. I told them I didn't need it." She paused. "I'm not good at sitting still." Elias gave a single nod and said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to make Rosie uncomfortable, and she did what she always did whenever a conversation moved too close to her. She pushed it toward the other person. "What about you?" Elias looked up. "Do you have family?" "I have a younger sister." "Where is she?" "Milwaukee." "Do you see each other often?" "No." His answer was so brief that Rosie knew she had just touched something, but she was already halfway there, and she was accustomed to asking children questions they didn't want to answer. "What about your parents?" And for the first time all evening, the man who never raised his voice, who answered every question in the steady tone of someone giving a statement, who had handed her his attorney's phone number without being asked, turned his face toward the window. There was nothing outside to see, only black glass and the faint reflection of the cabin staring back at him. He looked out at it long enough for Rosie to hear the engines change rhythm once. She looked at the cuff of his sleeve. Something dark lay beneath the fabric, only about the width of one finger joint visible. And she had noticed it when he picked up the sandwich earlier, but hadn't paid attention then. Now she did. It wasn't a watch band. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's fine." He still didn't turn back. "You don't have to answer." "I know," he said. Then he added, still looking out the window, in a voice much quieter than anything he had said since the beginning of the evening. "That's the first question anyone has asked me tonight that I had to think about before answering." Rosie didn't know what to say to that. She pulled the blanket a little higher and sat quietly, and in that silence she suddenly realized something that sent a chill down her spine. For the past 20 minutes, she had been telling a complete stranger about Wesley, telling the whole story, telling it smoothly, telling it exactly the way she had told everyone for the past 7 years. And in those 20 minutes, not a single word she had spoken was a lie, but not a single word was the truth either. Elias turned away from the window. He didn't say anything right away. He reached down to the cuff of his left sleeve, pulled the fabric back, and the thing Rosie had glimpsed earlier was fully revealed. A worn wooden rosary was wrapped 3 times around his wrist, the last bead polished smoother than all the others. "It was my mother's," he said. "She died 5 years ago." Rosie sat quietly. She was sick for 11 months. By the 10th month, the doctors told us she had only weeks left, and I heard them. But people don't really hear things like that. They hear it and still make plans for the following month. He spoke slowly, his voice never rising. "That night was a Tuesday. My sister called at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and said our mother had taken a turn for the worse." "Where were you?" 20 minutes from the hospital." Rosie looked up. "There was a sit-down that night," he said. "You don't need to know who was at the table. You only need to know that both sides had been counting each other for 4 months. And that night was the last night there was still a chance to talk. After that night, people weren't going to talk anymore." He looked down at the rosary. "My father had died 3 years earlier. People don't sit down at a table with an empty chair. If I didn't show up, that chair would be empty." "Who told you that?" "Someone told me. He was right. He didn't give a name. And I believed he was right. I still believe it." Rosie felt her hands grow cold beneath the blanket. You went to the table. I went to the table, he said. 7 o'clock that evening. We finished at 9:20. I got to the hospital at 5 minutes to 10. He paused for exactly 1 beat. She died at 9:15. There was no sound in the cabin except the steady hum of the engines. 40 minutes, he said. I've calculated that number over and over for 5 years. If I'd stood up 40 minutes earlier, I would have been there. Not an hour, not 2, 40 minutes. Rosie wanted to say something, but she knew every sentence she had would be useless, and she had taught long enough to understand that sometimes silence was the only kindness one person could offer another. My sister sat with her from 4 o'clock that afternoon, he continued. She told me about it afterward. She said our mother wasn't angry. Not one word. She only asked the nurse. He stopped. She asked 4 times. The first time at 6 o'clock, the second at 7:30, then 8, and the last time at 10 minutes to 9. Every time, exactly the same question. Has my boy come yet? Rosie raised a hand to cover her mouth. The nurse told her, soon. She nodded and said, all right, all right. There wasn't the slightest tremor in his voice when he said it, and it was that very flatness that Rosie couldn't bear. If she'd been angry, it would have been different. You can live with someone being angry at you. You can argue back, you can explain, you can apologize and wait to be forgiven. But she just waited. You can't argue with someone who waited for you. He pulled his sleeve back down, covering the rosary. Rosie asked the question she knew was cruel the moment it left her mouth, but she asked anyway. Because of all the questions she could have asked, it was the only honest one. Was that meeting worth it? Elias didn't look away. Yes. She stared at him. That table kept the peace, he said. If I hadn't sat down there that night, the next morning would have been very different. I've counted them. 30 people. 30 people who are still walking the streets of Chicago today because of those 2 hours and 20 minutes that night. He paused. Rosie waited for him to say what anyone would say at this point. The justification. The sentence that said, therefore I made the right choice, that my mother would have understood, that I saved 30 lives. He didn't say any of those things, and I'd still trade all 30 of them for those 40 minutes. Rosie sat frozen. You shouldn't say that. I know, he said, but it's the truth, and I stopped lying about this a long time ago. He looked at her. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because downstairs you asked why it was you. Rosie didn't breathe. Because I sat in that waiting area for 40 minutes, he said, and that's a number I can't bear anymore. Rosie didn't have time to say anything before the cockpit door opened. Hollis Brandt stepped into the cabin with nothing in his hands, wearing the expression of a man about to announce that dinner would be 15 minutes late. Sir, we've been ordered to land. Rosie sat up straight. Elias didn't move. Go on. The aircraft inspection record has been flagged as incomplete. 30 minutes ago, it was fully cleared in the system. Now it isn't. His voice remained as even as before. We're not permitted to continue the flight. I requested permission to proceed to Savannah and deal with it afterward. They refused. I requested Atlanta. They refused that too. Is there something wrong with the plane? Rosie asked, and she heard her own voice crack in the middle of the sentence. Ma'am, there is nothing wrong with the plane, Hollis said. It was fully inspected 9 days ago. I stood beside them while they did it. The problem isn't the airplane. And it was right there, precisely because he said it in the flat tone of a man reading a weather report rather than someone worried about the lives of his passengers, that Elias understood. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask whether it could be fixed. He asked only one question. Who controls the maintenance records? Hollis was silent for about 2 seconds. Rosie saw his jaw move once. Mr. Sartori, sir, since your father was still alive. No one said anything. Rosie could hear her own heartbeat. Elias turned toward the window, toward the black glass with nothing beyond it to see, and sat that way for a moment. Then he spoke very quietly, almost to himself. He didn't sabotage my plane. He sabotaged the paper. What does that mean? Rosie asked. It means if he wanted us to fall out of the sky, there were other ways. He was still looking at the window. He never touches machinery. He touches paperwork. He's been doing that since before I knew how to walk. He turned back to Hollis. Where can we put down? There's a small airport in eastern Tennessee, 22 minutes from here by air. They've agreed to take us. Other than that, there isn't another field in this radius willing to accept us. Take us there. Yes, sir. Hollis turned to leave, then stopped at the cockpit door. Sir, how long do you think it'll take to clear that flag from the system? I don't know. Sir, I truly don't know, Hollis. The cockpit door closed. Rosie sat beneath the blanket with her arms wrapped around her knees. What does he want? She asked. The man back at the hangar. What does he want? Elias didn't answer immediately. 7 hours from now, there's a table in Chicago, he said. He reminded me of it at the foot of the stairs, and I walked past him. That was an answer he couldn't accept. So he's forcing the plane to turn back? No. Elias shook his head. If he wanted me back in Chicago, he would have done it another way. He only needs me not to arrive. Rosie stared at him. I don't understand. He doesn't need me sitting at that table, Elias said. He only needs the whole city to see that when I disappear, everything keeps running. That the empty chair isn't as important as I think it is. He said it with complete calm, and Rosie realized he was explaining to her something he himself had only understood within the past 30 seconds. And as for where I'm going tonight and why, he doesn't care at all. But he knew I was a teacher. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. He knew. And he said nothing more, and that silence made Rosie colder than the answer itself. The plane began descending. The cabin lights brightened, and suddenly everything looked painfully awake, painfully clear, painfully unforgiving. Rosie opened her phone. 1:43 in the morning. She had been in the air for 1 hour and 20 minutes. If everything had gone as planned, she would now be 40 minutes by air from her father. She looked down at the canvas bag beside her, the bag full of third-grade papers she had carried all the way from school, and suddenly it seemed so meaningless that it was almost funny. Mr. Marchetti. He looked up. I need to get there. I know. No, she said. You don't know. I sold my father's chisels just to stand at that counter, and I still didn't have enough money. If I don't get there, then I sold them for exactly $190 and a trip to Tennessee. Elias said nothing. Outside, the dark ground slowly came into view through the small window. No city lights anywhere. Only 2 parallel rows of runway lights cutting through a stretch of blackness. The wheels touched down just before 2 o'clock in the morning. The waiting room at that airport had 12 plastic chairs, a vending machine, and a man sitting behind the counter watching something on his phone. He looked up when they walked in, glanced at the clock, then lowered his eyes again. Hollis came in last, and he stood talking to the man at the counter for about 10 minutes. Rosie watched his back for every one of those 10 minutes. When Hollis returned, his expression hadn't changed. 4 hours, he said. 4 hours at the earliest, ma'am. The first flight out of here is a cargo flight at 6:10, and it's headed back north. Rosie nodded. She nodded like someone who had just been told the store was closed. Then she walked to the corner of the room, took out her phone, and called the hospital. She had a signal. She had gotten one the moment the wheels touched the ground, and for the past 2 minutes, this was what she had feared most, more than anything else. The phone rang 4 times. This is Rosalie Kendrick. My father is Walter Kendrick. He was admitted to the emergency room tonight. She heard the tapping of a keyboard. Yes, miss. Kendrick. He's in intensive care. How is he? A pause. His condition hasn't changed. Rosie waited. She waited for the next sentence, the one that would tell her what she was supposed to do with what she had just heard. What does that mean? It means he's being monitored, and nothing has changed from 3 hours ago. The other person spoke in the voice of someone who had repeated that sentence 100 times in her life. Just get here when you can. Rosie stood with the phone pressed to her ear for several more seconds. Just get here when you can. There was no bad news to scream over. No good news to hold on to. There was only a door left open by the narrowest crack and a sentence telling her to keep going, to come whenever she could, with no one rushing her and no one promising her anything. She ended the call and stood facing the wall for about 10 seconds. Then she turned around and walked straight toward Elias. 4 hours, she said. I know. You know. She heard her voice break and didn't try to stop it. You know. You always know. You know my father's name. You know the staircase he built. You know he refused your envelope 15 years ago. You sat in that waiting area for 40 minutes and you knew what I'd just sold. You know everything. So do something. Elias said nothing. You have a private plane. She pointed toward the glass doors. You have a lawyer who answers his phone at 11 o'clock at night. You told me to go ask the airport police who you are, and I believe they really do know. People open car doors for you. People don't dare look you straight in the face. That whole city is afraid of you. Tears were running down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. And you're standing here with me in a waiting room with 12 plastic chairs at 2 o'clock in the morning, while my father is lying 800 miles away, and you can't do a damn thing. The man behind the counter looked up. Hollis turned his face away. You talked to me about 40 minutes, Rosie continued, and now she couldn't stop. You told me about your mother asking 4 times. Why did you tell me that? So I could sit here and know ahead of time what it's going to feel like? So I could prepare myself? She took a step back. I don't need you to prepare me. I need a plane. The entire room went silent. Elias looked at her, and in that moment, Rosie waited for everything she had been expecting all evening. She waited for him to get angry. She waited for him to remind her that without him, she would still be standing at that ticket counter. She waited for him to say something about gratitude. He didn't say any of it. He stood, picked up the coat draped over the back of his chair, and walked out the door. The glass door closed behind him with a very soft click. Rosie remained exactly where she was. Then her knees gave way, and she dropped into one of the plastic chairs. Hollis walked over to the counter and spoke to the man there in a very low voice. The vending machine made a sound, and then fell silent. Beyond the glass there was nothing but darkness, and 2 rows of runway lights, and not a single person in sight. She sat there thinking about Bertie in the hospital corridor, thinking about the cabinet her father had spent 5 months building, thinking about the words, "Just get here when you can," and she thought about how carefully, for 7 years, she had made sure she never had to ask anyone for anything, and tonight she had broken that rule exactly once, and within 4 hours, she had driven away the last person who had been willing to stay with her. He came back 40 minutes later. Rosie heard the glass door before she had time to look up, and by the time she did, he was already halfway across the room, his coat draped over one arm, his hair slightly damp from the night mist out on the runway. He didn't say where he had been. He didn't explain anything. He simply pulled over a plastic chair, sat down a little distance from her, and remained silent for about 10 seconds. "I'm sorry," Rosie said. "You don't need to be. I just said things to you that I had no right to say." "You had the right," he said. "You're afraid, and fear has to have somewhere to be put down. I was the closest person to you." She looked at her hands. Then he asked, "Where was Wesley going?" Rosie jerked her head up. It was a short question, and he had held it inside himself for more than an hour without saying it, and now he placed it between them like a stone set down on a table. She opened her mouth to give the answer she had been giving for 7 years, the one about the intersection of Archer and Kedzie, about the car that ran the light, about how it all happened very fast. She had said it to the police, to her co-workers, to the principal, to the people who came to pay their respects, to her own father. She could say it so smoothly that it had stopped being a story and become an object. But this time, she couldn't say it. She sat there in the waiting room with 12 plastic chairs, exhausted, 800 miles from her father, after 4 hours of watching every door close one by one, and she no longer had the strength to pick that object up. "To pick me up," she said. Elias didn't move. "That night I was working an extra shift at a diner on Halsted Street. I was 23 then. I just finished school, and I was paying off my student loans." Her voice was very quiet and very flat. The shift was supposed to end at 11 o'clock. It ran past midnight. It was raining. I stood in the doorway of the diner, and I was tired. So tired that I didn't want to walk to the bus stop, and the bus stop was only 3 blocks away. She swallowed. I texted Wesley 4 words. "Come pick me up." He texted back 1 word. "Okay." No one said anything. He was 20. He was at home. He was watching something on television. I don't know what. I never asked. He took my father's car keys and left. She stared at a fixed point on the floor. He made it 18 minutes. She sat quietly for a while before continuing, and now her voice began to break. "For 7 years, I've told everyone that my brother was on his way. That's true. He was on his way to me. Because I was tired. Because I didn't want to walk 3 blocks in the rain." She turned toward him, and something in her eyes had broken open and turned fierce. "So don't tell me about your 40 minutes anymore." Elias remained still. "You were late. Fine. You were 40 minutes late, and your mother asked 4 times. I understand. That's terrible. I understand. She was speaking faster now, almost choking on the words, but at least she was lying in a hospital bed. At least she got to stay in one place while she waited for you. She didn't die while she was on her way to find you. The sentence fell between them, and neither of them picked it up. Rosie heard what she had just said. She raised a hand to her mouth. Too late. The man behind the counter had gone outside at some point. Hollis wasn't in the room. There were only the two of them, and the faint hum of the vending machine. No, Elias said. Don't take it back. She looked at him. You're right, he said. You just said the thing I've been telling myself for 5 years every time I think I'm getting better. You don't need to apologize for saying something true. Then he asked her, very slowly, have you ever considered that Wesley went because he wanted to go? Rosie shook her head. He went because I told him to. You sent him 4 words. You didn't order anyone to do anything, he said. If he hadn't wanted to go, he would have texted back and told you to take the bus, or said he was busy, or he would have ignored you completely, the way millions of 20-year-old younger brothers all over the world do to their sisters after midnight. He paused. He texted back 1 word, okay, and he picked up the keys, and he went out into the rain at midnight. That was a kind thing to do. It may have been the last kind thing he ever did in his life. Rosie began to cry without making a sound. And for 7 years, Elias said, you've taken the last kind thing your brother ever did, and you've called it your fault. Rosie cried for about 2 minutes. Elias didn't say anything during those 2 minutes, didn't offer her a tissue, didn't put a hand on her shoulder, didn't do any of the things people usually do to make someone stop crying sooner. He simply sat there. Then he stood. Pick up your bag. Come with me. She looked up, her eyes still red. Where? Outside. She followed him through the glass door and into the night, and the cold air struck her face hard enough to wake her completely. Elias didn't head toward his own plane. He turned left and walked along the edge of the runway toward a row of low hangars about 1,000 feet away, a place that had looked like nothing more than a dark shape from inside the waiting room. Rosie hurried to keep up. Where did you go earlier? Out here. For 40 minutes. Yeah, he said nothing more. The third hangar had a small side door with a yellow light burning above it. Elias knocked. 3 times, neither fast nor slow. Rosie stepped back and watched that man standing there, knocking on someone else's door at 3 o'clock in the morning. And something strange rose in her chest that she still couldn't name. After a while, there was the sound of a latch. The door opened a few inches, and a man around 60 leaned his head out. His hair flattened on one side, wearing a sweatshirt and striped pajama pants. He looked at Elias, then at Rosie, then at the canvas bag on her shoulder. You again? Yes. I already told you. You said you'd think about it. I said I was going back to sleep. The man braced one hand against the doorframe. 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're knocking on my door for the 2nd time. I know. Do you know what you're asking me to do? I fly farm equipment and doctors going to conferences. I don't fly strangers at night. I understand. You don't look like a man who understands. Rosie waited. She waited for the moment when the other man would say a name and everything would change. Waited for Elias to pull out his phone. Waited for him to mention someone. Waited for that steady voice to drop even lower in the way that had made Ray Sartori step aside. But none of that happened. My name is Elias Marchetti, he said. I'll pay cash. Name your price, whatever you want, and if you think the number isn't enough, tell me and I'll pay more. Money isn't the problem. I know, but it's the only thing I have to offer you right now. The man studied him for a long moment. Who are you carrying? Elias tipped his head toward Rosie. Her. Who are you? The man asked her directly. Rosie heard herself answer before she had time to think. I'm a 3rd-grade teacher in Chicago. My father has been in intensive care in Savannah since 9 o'clock tonight. I don't have enough money for a plane ticket. This man was taking me there, and then his plane got grounded here because of its paperwork. The man nodded slowly. Then he looked back at Elias. What do you do for a living? I do a lot of things. That's not an answer. No, it isn't, Elias said, but it's the most truthful answer I have. The man stood in the doorway, with one hand still braced against the frame, and he looked at the 2 people in front of him longer than necessary. Rosie realized he wasn't looking at Elias. He was looking at her, at the canvas bag with its worn straps, at the white chalk streak on the sleeve of her sweater, at the swollen eyes of someone who had just finished crying. What's your father's name? Walter. The man let out a breath. I can get you to Savannah, but I'll have to stop for fuel in Augusta. My plane isn't like his. It's loud, it shakes, and there aren't any leather seats. That's fine, Rosie said. That's fine, sir. I can't get out until 4. I have to check the plane first. Yes. And you? He pointed at Elias. Pay up front. Yes. The door closed. Rosie stood on the cold concrete and turned to look at the man beside her. The man whom no one in an entire Chicago hangar had dared look directly in the face 2 hours earlier, and who had just knocked twice in the middle of the night to beg a gray-haired man in striped pajama pants for help. You came out here earlier, she said. Yeah. When I was yelling at you. Yeah. You didn't say anything. I was going to come back in and tell you he'd refused. He looked out toward the runway. Then I thought if I went back in right then, you'd think I'd walked out because you yelled at me. So I stayed outside a little longer. Rosie couldn't say anything. At 4:10, the little plane rolled onto the runway, and it really was loud. Before stepping aboard, Elias stopped on the first stair and turned toward her. You're coming with me, he said. 4 words. She had heard them 6 hours earlier at a bright white ticket counter at O'Hare. Back then, they had been the words of a man who had everything, speaking to a woman who had nothing left. Now both of them were standing there with nothing left in their hands, and those 4 words meant something entirely different. The old man had been right. The plane was so loud that if you wanted to say anything, you had to lean close to the other person's ear, and it shook in a way that made you grip the side of your seat every time it passed through a pocket of turbulence. Rosie sat on the right, the canvas bag wedged between her feet, and she didn't sleep for a single minute. In Augusta, they stopped for 40 minutes to refuel. It had begun to rain, and Rosie stood beneath the metal roof of the fuel station watching the clock on her phone change from 6:12 to 6:13. She didn't call the hospital again. She was afraid of hearing that sentence one more time. At 7:21 in the morning, the wheels touched down in Savannah. Her phone found a signal while the plane was still taxiing, and it began vibrating in her hand, over and over, in the way no one ever wants a phone in their hand to vibrate. 6 missed calls, all from the same number. All within the past 30 minutes. She called back, and her hand was shaking so badly that she had to press the number twice. This is Rosalie Kendrick. My father is Walter Kendrick. You just called me 6 times. She heard someone on the other end calling for another person. Then a different voice came on the line, a woman's voice, quick and precise. Miss Kendrick, your father's condition worsened about 25 minutes ago. The team is treating him right now. Rosie rose from her seat before the plane had even come to a complete stop. Is he still alive? He's being treated, ma'am. What does that mean? It means there is a medical team beside him as I'm speaking to you. Where are you? I just landed. Can you come immediately? Yes. Then come now. The line went dead. Elias was already on his feet. He said something very brief to the old pilot, picked up the canvas bag, and opened the door. It was raining, the heavy, warm kind of rain the South gets that time of year, and a car was already waiting at the edge of the tarmac, its red taillights blurred by the water. Rosie didn't ask when he had called for it. She ran. She ran across the wet concrete with her hair plastered to her cheeks, one hand gripping her phone, and climbed into the car with both shoulders soaked through. Elias got in behind her, closed the door, and gave the driver only the name of the hospital. The car surged forward. 25 minutes, Rosie said. His condition got worse 25 minutes ago, which means I was standing under that metal roof in Augusta, which means I was looking at the clock on my phone. She turned toward him. If we hadn't had to stop in Augusta, I'd be there by now. Elias said nothing. Say something. Say what? Tell me he's going to be all right. He looked at her, and Rosie knew immediately that he wasn't going to say it. She had known before, she asked. That was why she had asked. I can't say that, he said. Anyone can say that. People say it all the time. I know. Someone said it to me 5 years ago in a hospital hallway, and I believed them, and they lied. He looked out through the car window. I won't do that to you. Rosie turned away. Rainwater streamed in long trails down the glass beside her, and through it she could see low houses, enormous oak trees, warning signs that hadn't yet been lit, all of them distorted and sliding backward behind her. Then say something, she said. Anything. I can't stand the silence right now. Elias was quiet for one more beat. Then he said, very softly, We're going to him. Rosie nodded. She nodded several times, like a child who had been given the answer she needed rather than the answer she wanted. Then she began to speak. Walter Kendrick, she said. Walter Kendrick. She spoke her father's name into the space between her knees, her hands clasped together and pressed against her forehead. Walter James Kendrick, 66 years old. He built a cabinet for 5 months. He keeps hot sauce and boxes of cookies in it. Elias didn't interrupt her. He built a staircase without a single nail showing. He planed the handrail 3 times. He pushed the envelope back and said he'd already been paid. Her voice broke. He wouldn't have the surgery because he was afraid I'd have to pay for it. 18 months. For 18 months, he sat in that kitchen with the cabinet he built. And he didn't say one word to me about it. She lifted her head and looked forward through the windshield, through the 2 wipers sweeping back and forth. Walter Kendrick, she said again. She spoke the name like someone calling to another person across a very great distance, as though as long as she kept saying it steadily enough, clearly enough, there would still be a heart somewhere on the other side of the city that could hear her and keep beating. The car hadn't fully stopped before Rosie opened the door. She ran across the front courtyard, through 2 automatic doors, and into a brightly lit hallway that smelled of antiseptic and cold coffee. She gave her father's name to the woman at the reception desk, louder than necessary, and the woman simply pointed toward the far end of the hallway on the left. Rosie kept running. She turned the corner and saw a pair of gray double doors marked restricted access, with a small light glowing on the wall beside them. The doors were closed. She stopped 3 steps away. There were voices inside. Footsteps, the sound of some kind of machine. All of it almost completely swallowed by the doors. And there was nothing to see. Not a crack. Not a window. She raised a hand to push them open. Miss Kendrick. A woman around 40 in nursing scrubs approached her, not rushing, not blocking her, simply placing herself in the space between Rosie and the doors in the practiced way of someone who had done this many times before. I'm Corinne Beckett. I've been on duty tonight. My father is in there. Yes, let me in. I can't let you go in. Rosie stared at her. I've been flying all night. I know. I sold my father's things to buy a ticket, and I still didn't have enough money. And I had to ask a stranger for help, and his plane got grounded in Tennessee, and I just spent 4 hours sitting in a waiting room with 12 plastic chairs. Her voice kept rising. I'm here now. I made it. Let me in. Miss Kendrick, Corinne said still gently. You made it. You're here. That's real. But behind those doors right now, there are 7 people working on your father, and they need enough room to do their jobs. Rosie stood still. Then her shoulders dropped. She took 1 step back, then another, until her back touched the wall behind her. She looked down at her hands. They were empty. For the past 8 hours she had run, sold things, begged, sat on 2 airplanes, screamed at a man in a waiting room at 2 o'clock in the morning, and now she was standing here with nothing in her hands, and the doors had closed before she could reach them. Elias stood at the far end of the hallway, about 30 feet away, and he didn't come any closer. Corinne walked away, then returned about a minute later carrying a clear plastic bag with a label attached to it. These are his personal belongings, she said. We keep them when a patient is admitted. Your family, so you can take them. Rosie accepted the bag. It was so light that it hurt. Inside was a faded leather wallet, a pair of plastic-framed glasses with tape wrapped around one temple, and a flat carpenter's pencil, the kind people tuck behind an ear, and that never rolls off a table. The tip had been sharpened with a knife. The body of the pencil had been worn smooth exactly where a thumb would rest. Rosie took it out and sank to the hallway floor, her back still against the wall. Her father hadn't worked as a carpenter for 6 years. He had fallen from scaffolding. He couldn't lift heavy things anymore. He had sold off some of his equipment, and he spent his days sitting in the kitchen with the cabinet he had taken 5 months to build. For 6 years, she had visited him 4 or 5 times a year, cooked for him, checked his medication, argued with him about the surgery, and in all those 6 years, she had never once known that he still carried this pencil in his shirt pocket. He carried it everywhere. He had even carried it with him that morning when he collapsed in the kitchen. She sat there for a long time with the pencil in her hand. Then she opened the wallet. Inside were 3 bills, a health insurance card, an expired library card, and in the innermost compartment, behind a cloudy layer of plastic, there was a photograph. Wesley, 19 years old, standing outside the workshop, squinting against the sunlight, one hand raised in greeting to someone outside the frame. Rosie remembered that afternoon. She had taken the picture. She slipped a finger into the wallet compartment to pull the photograph out for a closer look, and she felt something behind it. A piece of paper, folded into quarters, thin, yellowed with age, and worn almost through along all four folds, in the way that could only happen when a piece of paper had been opened and folded again, hundreds of times over many years. Rosie stopped. At the far end of the hallway, the small light beside the gray doors was still glowing. Corinne had gone somewhere. Elias remained exactly where he had been, and Rosie sat on the floor with the open wallet in her lap, her thumb resting against the worn fold of a piece of paper she had never known existed. She pulled the paper out and unfolded it across her lap. It tore slightly along the center crease, where it had been opened and folded so many times that the fibers had finally begun to give way. It was a printout, a yellowed sheet of A4 paper, printed on a dot matrix printer, with a heading in the upper corner referring to a case file and a string of numbers, and beneath it, a 3-column table. Time. Number. Content. Rosie saw her old phone number on the first line. 12:19 a.m. Come pick me up. 12:21 a.m. Okay, and below that, on the final line, there was another timestamp, 12:39 a.m., with the content column left blank. She had never known that last line existed. 18 minutes. She sat completely still. The sounds of machines behind the gray doors were still there, but now she couldn't hear them. She thought about that night 7 years ago, about the 2 police officers standing at the front door, about her father opening it, and about how for 7 years she had retold that night hundreds of times to dozens of people without ever once letting those 4 words slip out. She had been careful. She had been so careful that it had become a second profession, and all it took to break through that carefulness was one sheet of paper the police had handed her father 3 weeks after the funeral, along with the rest of the case file, the way they gave such things to next of kin. He had taken it home. He had read it. He had known. Rosie turned the paper over. There was writing on the back. Carpenter's pencil, thick and flat, the same kind of marks she had seen on thousands of boards throughout her childhood, written in block letters because her father never used lowercase when he marked material. The girl mustn't know I know. She'll eat herself alive. Beneath it, 1 line lower, in a different, finer kind of ink, as though written on a very different day. It wasn't your fault, Rosie. She brought both hands to her face. For 7 years, she had thought she was keeping a secret. She had thought she was carrying it alone, so her father wouldn't have to carry it too. She had sat across from him at hundreds of meals, argued with him about the surgery, stood beside him at the cemetery every November, and through all of it she had believed she was protecting him from something he didn't know, and he had been sitting on the other side of the table with that paper in his wallet, knowing everything, keeping silent for 7 years so she wouldn't have to carry the added burden of knowing that he knew. He had been protecting her, by saying nothing, by letting her believe she had managed to hide it. Rosie made a sound she didn't recognize as her own. She folded forward, the paper still in her hand, and cried on the hallway floor of a hospital in a city where she didn't live, exactly 3 steps from the gray doors. Footsteps approached and then stopped. Elias said nothing. He didn't ask what the paper was. He didn't reach for it. He simply sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the same wall, his knees drawn up, and stayed there in silence. A long time passed before Rosie could speak. He knew. Elias kept looking straight ahead. He's known for 7 years, she said. He carried this in his wallet. He opened it and folded it back up. Look at it. The folds are almost torn through. I don't even know how many times he opened it. She drew in a trembling breath. And he never said a single word to me. What did he write? Rosie read both lines aloud to him. Elias sat very still for a long time after she finished. Earlier, I told you Wesley went because he wanted to go, he said. Yeah. I said that because I believed it was true, but I'm a stranger. I've known you 8 hours, and you have every reason not to believe me. He nodded toward the paper in her hand. But you can't argue with that. Rosie looked down, the flat pencil strokes. The block letters, written on the back of a piece of paper no one was ever supposed to see. Who did he write it for? She asked. No one could read it. He hid it in his wallet. Who was he writing it for? Elias looked toward the gray doors at the end of the hallway, where the small light was still glowing. For today, he said. Corinne came back just before 9 o'clock. and said the team had managed to stabilize her father's heart rhythm, that he was being transferred to intensive care, that now they had entered a period of observation and no one could say anything more yet. Rosie asked if she could go in. Not yet. When? They didn't know. Corinne led the two of them to a smaller waiting room upstairs, with 4 upholstered chairs and a window overlooking the rain-soaked parking lot, and said she would come up immediately if there was any news. Rosie sat down with the folded paper still in her palm. Elias got up and walked into the hallway. He took out his phone, found a name in his contacts, and stared at it for about 10 seconds before pressing call. The phone rang 3 times. Hello? He heard his younger sister's voice, the voice of someone who had just opened her shop for the morning and was holding the phone between her shoulder and her ear. Tony. There was a silence that lasted exactly 1 breath. Then the call ended. Elias stood looking at the screen for a moment. Then he called again. This time it rang 7 times, long enough for him to know she was holding the phone in her hand and looking at it. What do you want? Nothing. It's been 3 years. You don't call me at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning because you want nothing. I'm at a hospital in Savannah. Something dropped on the other end of the line. The sound of a pair of scissors being set down on a table. What happened to you? Nothing. I'm fine. I'm here with someone. A teacher. I met her at the airport last night. Her father was admitted to the hospital, and she didn't have enough money for a ticket. Elias spoke in his usual even voice, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. We got stranded in Tennessee overnight. We only made it here this morning. Her father just came through a serious turn. Antonia was silent. Why are you telling me this? Because 5 years ago you sat beside Mom and I didn't, he said. And tonight I'm not going anywhere. There was a long exhale on the other end of the line. Then Elias heard his sister cry, very softly, for exactly 3 seconds before stopping. The way someone cries when they've spent years learning not to do it in front of other people. You know something, don't you? She said. Know what? You don't know. Her voice changed completely. You didn't call me because of that, Tony. Uncle Ray came to see me 3 weeks ago. Elias stood motionless in the hospital hallway. He drove from Chicago to Milwaukee, parked outside my flower shop at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sat in the car for 20 minutes before he came inside. Antonia spoke quickly, as though she were afraid that if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to continue. He asked if I could still make the old-style funeral wreaths, the kind people used to make for the church on Taylor Street years ago. I told him I could. He said good. She stopped. Then he handed me a piece of paper with the name of a song and the priest's name on it, and he told me to keep it and not give it to anyone. Tony. A few months, Elias. He told me a few months. Elias said nothing. He stood there with one hand holding the phone to his ear, the other hanging at his side, staring down at the pale green vinyl floor of the hallway. He told me not to tell you, Antonia said. I asked him why. He said the boy will look at me differently, and I don't need anyone looking at me that way during my last few months. He hid it from me. He hid it from everyone. I was the only one who knew because I'm not part of the family anymore. Elias closed his eyes. In his mind, the hangar at O'Hare appeared with perfect clarity. The salt and pepper-haired man standing in his way at the foot of the stairs. The words about the empty chair. The way he hadn't stepped aside when Elias approached. And the way he hadn't stopped him either. And then, 30 minutes after the plane took off, a flag had appeared on a line of data in a system that only 2 people in the world were allowed to touch. Are you still there? Yeah. What are you going to do? I don't know, he said. Then he added, very quietly, almost only to himself. So he's racing a clock, too. Antonia didn't ask what he meant. Before ending the call, she said only one thing. Stay there. He went back into the waiting room. Rosie was asleep. She was sleeping upright, her head tilted to one side, one hand still gripping the paper folded into quarters, the other resting on the canvas bag full of her students' papers that she had carried for 800 miles. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, and the parking lot was beginning to steam beneath the sunlight. Elias stood watching her for a moment. Then he took off his coat and laid it over her carefully, without touching her shoulder. He sat down in the chair across from her and didn't sleep. 2 hours later, Rosie woke, and the first thing she realized was that there was a coat covering her, and the second was that she couldn't remember the last time someone had stayed awake while she slept. Corinne came up with the news just before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. His heart rhythm had remained stable for 4 hours. His blood pressure had come back up, and he had regained consciousness 20 minutes earlier. Rosie stood so quickly that the coat covering her slipped onto the chair. Room 4 was at the end of the hall. Her father was lying with his head turned toward the door, and when she walked in, he was looking that way, as though he had been staring at it for quite some time. He looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing that struck her, and it hurt more than anything else. She walked to the bedside and took his hand, the hand with 3 calloused fingertips that hadn't softened in 40 years. And for about 10 seconds she said nothing, because she couldn't. Then she opened her other hand and placed the paper folded into quarters on the edge of the bed beside his hand. Walter looked down at it. She saw his eyes stop there, saw him recognize it immediately, saw him understand that she had opened his wallet, and she waited for an explanation, an apology. A sentence beginning with, "I meant to tell you, but," he said none of those things. "You made it," he said. His voice was hoarse and very quiet, almost nothing but breath. Rosie nodded, and her tears fell onto the back of his hand. "I made it, Dad." "I know." He took a breath. "I knew you would." She bent down until her forehead rested against his hand. She cried, and this time she didn't turn her face away, didn't cover it with her hands, didn't apologize to anyone for being a burden. In 6 years of teaching, she had comforted hundreds of crying children with the words, "It's okay." And for 7 years she had never once allowed herself to not be okay. Walter let her cry. Then he moved one finger and touched the paper. "I kept it for 7 years so you wouldn't have to," he said. Rosie looked up. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" he asked. "Tell you I'd read it? And then what?" He looked at her for a long time. "Then every time you looked at me, you'd remember that I knew. I didn't want you to have to look at me that way. I thought I'd managed to hide it from you." "I know you did," he said. "That's why I kept quiet." She sat down in the chair beside the bed, still holding his hand in both of hers. A long while later, Walter's eyes shifted downward toward the canvas bag she had placed at the foot of the chair. Then he looked at her shoulder, then at her hands. "Where are the chisels?" Rosie stopped breathing. "You've been carrying them around since March," he said. "You kept them in that bag. I saw them a few times." She couldn't speak. She only nodded once, very slightly. "Sold them?" "Yes," she said. "At the airport. They gave me $190. Her voice broke on the final word. "And it still wasn't enough, Dad. It still wasn't enough." Walter closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. "Good," he said. Rosie's head snapped up. "They're wood and iron," he said. "You're not." She folded forward again. Outside the window, an ambulance pulled in, its siren sounding briefly before going silent. A little while later, Walter spoke again, his eyes still fixed on the ceiling. "Go get the doctor for me." "What for?" "So I can sign that paper." Rosie sat completely still. 18 months. For 18 months, she had argued with him over the phone. For 18 months, she had printed out information and mailed it to him. For 18 months, he had repeated the same words. "I'm fine. I don't need it. You keep that money and take care of yourself." "Why did you change your mind?" she asked. Walter turned his head toward her. "Because you sold my chisels to get here," he said. "If I keep hiding now, then the price you just paid becomes meaningless." Corinne came in to check his vital signs again, and Rosie stepped into the hallway to get the doctor. When she returned, the door to the room was open, and Elias was standing outside, about 1 step from the doorway, his hands empty, making no move to enter. Walter looked toward him. He studied the man for quite a while, and Rosie saw something pass slowly across her father's face, the gradual recognition of a man who had just come through a very long night. "Marchetti," he said. Elias inclined his head slightly. Walter didn't ask why he was there. He didn't offer any words of thanks either. He lay still for a moment, then said exactly 2 sentences, with a silence between them, long enough for Rosie to hold her breath. "I still think I was right back then." Then he said, "I don't think I'm right now." Ray Sartori arrived in Savannah the following afternoon. He didn't announce that he was coming. Elias was sitting in the 3rd floor waiting room when he saw Ray step out of the elevator, still wearing that same heavy coat even though it was 86 degrees outside, walking with the stride of a man who already knew exactly where he would find the person he had come to see. The 3rd floor hallway was quiet at that hour. A small table stood against the wall with 2 chairs, the place where people usually sat during the day to fill out paperwork. Ray pulled out one chair and sat down. Elias took the other. "You missed the table in Chicago?" Ray said. "Yes. Do you know what happened?" Nothing happened, Elias said. They sat for 2 hours, talked about a few things, and went home. I already heard about it. That's right. Ray nodded slowly. Nothing happened. That's the problem. Elias didn't answer. For 30 years, we've sold them the idea that the chair matters, Ray said. Your father sold it successfully. You just showed them it doesn't matter. You can't take that back, you understand. That kind of belief only has to be lost once. I understand. You don't look sorry. I am sorry, Elias said. Just not as sorry as you are. Ray looked at him. Neither man raised his voice. At the far end of the hallway, a nurse pushed a medication cart past them, and neither of them looked up. Elias reached inside his jacket and took out a small notebook. Its leather cover worn, about the size of his palm. He placed it on the table and pushed it across. Read it. What's this? Names. Ray opened it. The first page had a date in the upper corner, and beneath it was a column of names written by hand in blue ink, one person on each line. He turned to the second page, then the third. 37 people at the South Dock, Elias said. 22 at the shop we shut down last year. 9 at the place on Ashland. Every time we make a decision and someone loses a job because of it, I write down their name. Ray didn't look up. He read very slowly, his thumb running along the edge of the page. There's a number beside every name, Elias continued. That's how many people are in their household. Some have 4, some have 5. Ray turned another page. You want to keep everything exactly the way it's always been, Elias said. Fine. This is the price of keeping it exactly the way it's always been. Pick it up and read every line. Then tell me again that you still want to keep it. Ray said nothing for a very long time. He read the entire notebook, went back to the beginning, and read it a second time. Elias didn't rush him. He didn't say a single word about the flag that had appeared on the inspection record at 11 o'clock 2 nights earlier. He didn't say a word about the flower shop in Milwaukee, about the old-style funeral wreath, about the piece of paper with the song title and the priest's name written on it. He simply sat there and let the man read. At last, Ray closed the notebook and rested his hand on it. Your father had one of these too, he said. I know. Ray looked up. I found it, Elias said. In the safe after he died. It was a lot thicker than this one. Did you read it? Every page. Ray looked at him for a long time, and in that moment something very faint passed across the face of the 52-year-old man, something like the exhaustion that 40 years had never allowed him to put down. He never told me he had that notebook, Ray said. He never told me either. Ray pushed the notebook back toward Elias. He stood, straightened the front of his coat, and didn't offer his hand. He had gone 3 steps when he stopped and turned halfway around, one hand resting on the frame of the doorway leading toward the elevators. He didn't look at Elias. He looked down at the hallway floor. That night, he said. Elias remained still. I was the one who told you to stay at the table. Neither of them said anything else. The elevator chimed at the far end of the hallway. Don't be late again, Ray said. Then he walked away. 3 weeks later, after Walter had returned home and was waiting for his surgery date, Elias told Rosie that he wanted to fund her program. She refused immediately. I won't stand in front of a classroom using money I can't explain to anyone, she said. If someone asks me one day where this money came from, I need to be able to answer. He didn't argue. He asked her what she wanted, and she told him plainly, and they spent that entire afternoon discussing it in the kitchen with the cabinet her father had taken 5 months to build. The foundation would bear his mother's name, Filomena Marchetti. Every expenditure would be made public. There would be an independent audit every year, conducted by a firm Rosie chose herself. She would sit on the board and have voting authority over the entire education program. Before they signed, Elias added one provision of his own. The 37 workers from the South Dock would be admitted into the Foundation's vocational training program with no tuition and a stipend for the first 6 months. That night he opened the worn leather notebook and crossed out each name one by one, slowly, line by line, and he kept doing it until nearly dawn. Walter's surgery took place in September and was successful. 6 weeks later, he was able to stand on his own in the workshop, and the first thing he did once he could hold tools again was carve himself a walking stick from oak, straight, without decoration, with a handle he planed exactly 3 times. The old cat, Sawdust, slept in the armchair beside the window all that afternoon, and didn't bother lifting its head even once. Antonia drove down from Milwaukee to Chicago in November, carrying a large bouquet of flowers, and she stood in the doorway for a while before stepping inside. Dinner that evening was awkward for the first 40 minutes, and less awkward after that. Rosie's school was consolidated at the end of the academic year, and her old class was dissolved. But she took over the Foundation's after-school program, and there she once again had a room filled with noise. On the first Wednesday afternoon, she asked the children to write about someone who had taught them something. The whole class fought to raise their hands first and read aloud. Micah stood and read his paper, loudly, stumbling over one place and then starting the sentence again from the beginning. And when he finished, the entire room applauded while someone at the back table shouted that they wanted to read next. Rosie leaned against the wall and watched, and she didn't say anything at all. That winter, at the bus terminal on Harrison Street, Rosie heard someone arguing at the ticket counter. A young man around 22, a backpack hanging from one shoulder, kept repeating that he was only $60 short. His mother had just been taken to the emergency room in Cleveland. He had called 2 friends, and neither had answered. Rosie stopped. Elias stopped with her. She walked over and asked the young man if he was all right, and he turned toward them with the expression of someone who had just been asked a question too kind for how late things had become. He took half a step back. "Who are you two?" "You're right to be suspicious," Rosie said. "Don't take money from strangers without checking them first. Go ahead and check us." And beside her, without needing to be reminded, Elias had already taken out his identification and placed it on the counter, along with his lawyer's phone number, handwritten on the back of a receipt. The young man looked down, then up, then toward the ticket agent standing silently behind the glass. "Why are you doing this?" "Because someone did it for me," Rosie said. "How am I supposed to pay you back?" "Don't pay me," she said. "Some debts aren't paid with money. Pay the next person when your turn comes." Then she said to him the 4 words a stranger had once said to her on a June night at O'Hare Airport. 4 words she had heard twice in one night and understood in 2 completely different ways. "You're coming with us." Years later, when Rosie was older, she understood that for 7 years she had confused 2 entirely different things. She had thought that needing no one meant being strong. In truth, it had only been a very elaborate way of making sure she never owed anyone anything. The real gift that man had given her that night wasn't the airplane. Hundreds of people had walked past her at the airport that night, and all of them were busy, and all of them had perfectly valid reasons, and only one person stopped and decided that her pain mattered. She also came to understand that some people love us by staying silent for years, and we only realize it when it is almost too late, when the paper in their wallet has worn thin along all 4 folds. The most important moments in a person's life rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as very ordinary choices. Answering a phone call, sitting down beside someone, asking how someone is doing and waiting long enough to hear the real answer. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to compelling stories every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please leave a comment and tell us what it stirred deep within your heart. We wish you abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.